The music stopped the moment the doors opened, and Eleanor Whitmore felt her whole future change in a single breath. Only a heartbeat before, she had been laughing with her cousins near the tall windows of Lady Marchmont's ballroom, half hidden behind a cluster of feathered fans and older women who never seemed to stop talking about marriage. Eleanor was tired of the subject. She was tired of her mother's sighs, tired of her sister's smug glances, tired of being 23 years old and still called the plain one, the quiet one, the one nobody had chosen yet. Her family had never made a secret of their disappointment. Her mother reminded her daily that most women her age already had a husband and a household of their own, while Eleanor still slept in the same narrow bedroom she had occupied since childhood. Her father rarely spoke of it directly, but she often caught him watching her with a quiet worry that felt heavier than any lecture. Margaret, only a year older, had married well the previous spring, and since then every gathering seemed designed to remind Eleanor of the gap between her sister's success and her own uncertain future. She had grown used to standing at the edges of ballrooms, watching other women dance while she counted the minutes until she could reasonably ask to go home. Tonight had been meant as a small escape from all of that. Lady Marchmont's ball was crowded and warm, filled with candlelight and the low hum of 100 conversations, and for a little while, Eleanor had almost forgotten to feel like the disappointment everyone else seemed to see. Her cousins had a way of pulling her out of her own head, teasing her gently until she forgot to worry about who was watching or what they thought. So when her cousin Louisa teased her about growing old alone, Eleanor had thrown up her hands and said the first reckless thing that came into her head. "I will marry the next man who walks through that door," she declared, loud enough for the group around her to hear, her voice bright with mockery rather than sincerity. "Whoever he is. I do not care if he is old, poor, or has 3 chins. That will be my husband, and you shall all be witnesses." Her cousins had laughed, delighted by her boldness. Louisa clapped her hands together and called it the funniest thing she had heard all season. Beatrice, always dramatic, pressed a hand to her chest and declared she wished she had thought of it first. For a moment, Eleanor felt lighter than she had in weeks. It was only a joke, a small rebellion against a world that measured her worth by whether some stranger found her pleasing enough to marry. Then the doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open, and every candle in the room seemed to hold its breath. The Duke of Ashcombe stepped through, tall and composed, dressed in dark blue that made the rest of the room look faded by comparison. Conversations halted. Fans stopped fluttering mid-air. Even the musicians on the small stage faltered for half a note before catching themselves again. Every unmarried woman in the ballroom, and a fair number of married ones, turned toward him as though pulled by some invisible thread. Eleanor's stomach dropped. Of all the men who might have walked through that door in that exact moment, fate had chosen the one man the entire season had been chasing without success. Nathaniel Ashford, Duke of Ashcombe, had inherited his title 2 years ago and had spent every month since fending off mothers, sisters, and ambitious young women who saw him as nothing more than a title attached to a fortune. He rarely attended balls. He almost never stayed past the first hour when he did. And yet here he was, walking directly into the one moment Eleanor least wanted him to witness. She turned quickly to hush her cousins, but it was already too late. Louisa, still laughing from the joke, had spoken just loud enough, and 2 young women standing nearby had heard every word. Eleanor watched with rising horror as one of them leaned toward her companion and whispered behind a gloved hand, her eyes darting between Eleanor and the Duke with unmistakable glee. By the time the second dance began, the whisper had grown legs. Eleanor had lived through small embarrassments before, the kind every young woman endured in a season built on gossip and appearances, but nothing had prepared her for the speed at which this particular story moved. It seemed to travel faster than the musicians could finish a single song, passing from one cluster of guests to the next until there was hardly a corner of the ballroom that had not heard some version of it. She watched a woman she barely knew lean toward her friend, saw the friend's eyebrows lift in surprise, and felt her stomach twist a little tighter each time the pattern repeated itself. Eleanor tried to disappear into the crowd, but the room felt smaller with every passing minute. She caught fragments of her own joke repeated back to her through strangers' mouths, twisted slightly each time it passed from one guest to another. Someone said she had declared she would marry the Duke the instant he arrived. Someone else insisted she had been waiting by the door all evening, watching for him specifically. By the time the story reached the older matrons seated near the refreshment table, it had become a tale of calculated ambition rather than a careless joke born of frustration. Her sister Margaret found her first, weaving through the crowd with an expression caught between horror and delight. "Eleanor, what have you done?" Margaret hissed, pulling her toward a quieter corner near the tall windows. "Half the room is saying you announced your intention to marry the Duke of Ashcombe the moment he walked in. Do you understand what that sounds like?" Do you understand how that will look to him? It was a joke, Eleanor whispered back, her cheeks burning. I was talking to Louisa and Beatrice. I never meant for anyone else to hear it, let alone repeat it as though I meant it seriously. Margaret glanced nervously across the room, where a cluster of women stood watching Eleanor with open curiosity, their eyes bright with the particular hunger of people who have found something delicious to discuss for weeks to come. It does not matter what you meant, Margaret said quietly. It only matters what people believe. And right now they believe you set your sights on the most sought-after man in London and declared it to a room full of witnesses. Eleanor wanted to sink into the polished floor and vanish entirely. She thought of her mother's reaction when the story reached her, as it surely would within the hour. She thought of the newspapers that loved nothing more than a fresh scandal involving a duke. She thought of the duke himself, somewhere across that vast room, perhaps already hearing the story secondhand, perhaps already deciding what sort of woman would say such a thing aloud. She did not have to wonder for long. A shift moved through the crowd near the center of the room, a parting of silk skirts and dark coats, and Eleanor turned to see the Duke of Ashcombe walking directly toward her. He moved without hurry, without hesitation, as though the entire ballroom were simply a corridor he intended to walk through until he reached his destination. His destination, it became horribly clear, was her. Whispers followed him like a wake behind a ship. Eleanor felt every eye in the room shift from the Duke to her and back again, felt the weight of 100 silent questions pressing down on her shoulders. She wanted to run, but her feet refused to obey her, rooted to the floor as firmly as the marble columns lining the walls. He stopped before her and offered a bow so precise it might have been measured with a ruler. "Miss Whitmore, I believe," he said, his voice calm and unreadable. "I understand I have arrived at a rather significant moment." Eleanor's throat closed entirely. Beside her, Margaret made a small strangled sound and pretended to be very interested in her fan. "Your Grace," Eleanor managed, dropping into a curtsy that felt far too shallow for the disaster unfolding around her. "I must apologize. Whatever you have heard was never intended as anything more than a joke between myself and my cousins. I had no idea anyone beyond our small circle would hear it, and certainly no idea that you would be the one to walk through that door." A flicker of something crossed his face, too quick for Eleanor to name. Amusement, perhaps, or something closer to curiosity. "So it was entirely accidental," he said. "You did not, in fact, station yourself by the entrance and wait to see which unfortunate man might wander in." "Certainly not," Eleanor said, and then, because her nerves had stripped away whatever caution she usually possessed, added, "If I had been planning such a thing, Your Grace, I assure you I would have chosen someone considerably less likely to draw the attention of every person in London." For a moment the Duke simply looked at her, and Eleanor feared she had said something unforgivably rude to one of the most powerful men in the country. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth lifted, just slightly, just enough to soften the sharp line of his jaw. "That, Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "is the first honest thing anyone has said to me all evening." Around them, the whispers continued to spread, growing louder, more elaborate, more impossible to contain. Eleanor's mother had appeared at the edge of the crowd now, her face pale with a mixture of horror and calculation, already imagining the consequences of a scandal that could either ruin her daughter completely, or, if handled correctly, elevate the entire family beyond anything they had dared hope for. Eleanor's mother pressed a hand to her mouth, torn between rushing forward to intervene and staying perfectly still so as not to disturb whatever strange conversation was unfolding in front of half the ballroom. Her father, standing a little apart, watched with an expression Eleanor could not quite read, something between alarm and cautious hope. Even Louisa and Beatrice had gone quiet, their earlier laughter replaced by wide eyes and clasped hands, as though they understood that the joke they had encouraged only minutes ago had somehow grown far larger than any of them intended. The Duke glanced past Eleanor's shoulder at the sea of watching faces, then back at her, and something in his expression shifted, grew more deliberate, more considering. "It seems," he said slowly, "that you and I have found ourselves at the center of quite an interesting problem, Miss Whitmore. I wonder if you might allow me a few minutes of your time to discuss it, somewhere with rather fewer witnesses, if such a place still exists in this house tonight." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as she glanced at her sister, at her mother's stricken face, at the wall of curious eyes that had not looked away since the moment the doors first opened. She did not know what the Duke intended to say to her, whether he meant to demand a public denial, to laugh the entire matter away, or to propose something far stranger than either. She only knew that her careless joke had already changed everything, and there was no way left to take it back. "Very well, Your Grace," she said, and followed him toward the terrace doors, unaware that the true story of her life was only just beginning. The terrace was cold and mercifully empty, and Eleanor had never been so grateful for silence. She stood near the stone railing, her arms wrapped around herself against the night air, watching the Duke of Ashcombe close the glass doors behind them, until the noise of the ballroom faded into a low, distant hum. Through the glass she could still see her mother's pale face pressed close to a window, and Margaret standing rigid beside her, both women clearly torn between curiosity and panic. "I imagine you are wondering why I did not simply laugh off the rumor and walk away," the Duke said, moving to stand a respectful distance from her, his hands clasped behind his back. "It would have been the easier choice. It would have saved us both a great deal of embarrassment," Eleanor admitted. "I still do not understand why you did not choose it." He was quiet for a moment, studying the dark garden beyond the terrace rather than looking at her directly. "Because embarrassment is not actually the thing I am most afraid of, Miss Whitmore," he said finally. "I have grown rather used to being embarrassed. What I am tired of is being hunted." Eleanor blinked, uncertain she had heard him correctly. "Hunted, Your Grace?" He turned to face her then, and for the first time since he had entered the ballroom, something like genuine weariness showed through his composed exterior. "Since I inherited my title," he said, "I have been introduced to more daughters, nieces, and family friends than I can count. Every mother in London seems to have decided that I am a solution to her family's every difficulty. I am invited to dinners I do not wish to attend, seated beside women who have clearly memorized lists of my supposed favorite subjects beforehand, and asked, at least once a week, whether I have given any thought to settling down. I am not a man to them, Miss Whitmore. I am a title with a fortune attached, and everyone wants a piece of it." Eleanor did not know what to say to that. She had spent so many months resenting her own lack of prospects that she had never once considered what it might be like to have too many, to be so relentlessly pursued that the pursuit itself became a burden. "That sounds exhausting," she said honestly, "and I am sorry for it, but I do not see what any of that has to do with me." The Duke allowed himself a small, tired smile. "Tonight," he said, "you accidentally handed me something no scheming mother or ambitious young woman has managed to offer me in 2 years. An excuse. If word spreads that you and I have some understanding between us, however informal, every calculating parent in London will have to look elsewhere for the season. I would have a reprieve, however brief, from being treated like a prize to be won." Eleanor stared at him, trying to make sense of what he was suggesting. "You want people to believe we have an understanding," she repeated slowly. "An engagement, you mean? Not a real one," he said quickly. "Not unless you wished it to become real, which I would never presume to expect. I am simply suggesting that we allow the rumor already spreading through that ballroom to stand, for a time. Let people believe there is something between us. It would shield you from whatever consequences your family might otherwise face for the joke, and it would shield me from the season's most determined fortune hunters. When the season ends, we could quietly and mutually decide the match was not suited, and both return to our lives with considerably more peace than we currently enjoy." Eleanor turned the idea over carefully, searching for the flaw in it, the trap she felt certain must be hidden somewhere inside such a strange proposal. "And what would I gain from this arrangement precisely?" she asked, "besides your protection from women you find tiresome?" The Duke considered the question seriously, as though he had expected it and respected her enough to answer honestly. "You would gain time," he said. "Time without your mother pressing every available bachelor upon you. Time without your sister's comparisons hanging over every conversation. Time to decide what you actually want from your life, rather than what is expected of you. And, if I am honest, you would gain a certain protection of your own. No one will dare mock the woman rumored to be engaged to a duke, however briefly that engagement may last." It was, Eleanor had to admit, a strangely compelling offer. She thought of the weeks stretching ahead of her, weeks that would otherwise be filled with her mother's anxious matchmaking, and Margaret's pointed comments about wasted opportunities. She thought of the whispers already spreading through the ballroom behind her, whispers that would only grow crueler if she denied the Duke publicly, and appeared foolish for having joked so carelessly in the first place. "And if I agree," she said slowly, "what exactly would this arrangement require of me? I have never pretended at an engagement before. I do not know the rules of such a performance." "The rules are simple enough," the Duke said. "We would be seen together occasionally, at events where our absence together would be noticed. We would speak kindly of one another when the subject arose. Beyond that, I would ask nothing else of you. No promises beyond what is necessary to maintain the appearance, and no expectations that either of us feel anything beyond a practical alliance. When the season ends, or when either of us wishes to end the arrangement sooner, we part as friends, with no obligation lingering between us. Eleanor studied his face in the dim light spilling from the ballroom windows, searching for some sign of deception, some hint that his motives were less honorable than he claimed. She found nothing but a tired sincerity that surprised her more than any grand romantic gesture might have. "I have one condition," she said finally, straightening her shoulders. "If we are to do this, I will not be treated as an ornament. I understand this is a practical arrangement, but I will not stand silently beside you at every gathering while you speak for both of us. If I have opinions, I intend to share them, even if they are inconvenient." Something flickered across the Duke's face, an expression closer to genuine amusement than anything he had shown her yet. "I would expect nothing less, Miss Whitmore," he said. "In fact, I suspect I would find the arrangement considerably duller if you did not." "Then we have an understanding," Eleanor said, extending her hand toward him with a formality that felt slightly absurd given the strangeness of what they were agreeing to. The Duke took her hand and bowed over it briefly, his grip warm and steady. "We have an understanding," he agreed. When they returned to the ballroom a few minutes later, the change in the room was immediate and unmistakable. Every eye turned toward them, every conversation paused mid-sentence, and Eleanor felt the full weight of London's curiosity settle over her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Her mother rushed forward the moment they crossed the threshold, her face a mixture of relief and barely contained excitement, already calculating the social advantages such a match might bring to the family. "Eleanor, darling, is it true?" her mother whispered urgently, gripping her arm. "Is there truly an understanding between you and His Grace?" Eleanor glanced at the Duke, who inclined his head slightly, granting her the choice of how to answer. "There is an understanding, Mother," Eleanor said carefully, choosing her words with more precision than she had ever used before. "Nothing is settled beyond that." It was enough. Within minutes, the news had spread through the ballroom faster than the original rumor had, carried on the eager tongues of guests who had been present for the strange scene at the terrace doors. Eleanor caught sight of several women watching her with expressions ranging from disbelief to open resentment, their earlier amusement curdling into something sharper now that the joke had apparently become something real, or at least something the Duke himself had chosen not to deny. Among the watching faces, one in particular caught Eleanor's attention. Lady Charlotte Vane stood near the refreshment table, her expression carefully composed into polite interest, though her eyes held something colder as they moved between Eleanor and the Duke. Eleanor had heard whispers all season that Lady Charlotte considered herself the natural choice for the Duke's attention, favored by both fortune and family connection, and had been quietly furious that he had shown no particular interest in pursuing her, despite every encouragement offered. Eleanor did not yet know how much trouble that cold, careful gaze would eventually cause her, but something in the pit of her stomach warned her that the evening's strangest turn had not yet finished unfolding. The rest of the ball passed in a blur of introductions and careful conversation, Eleanor performing her new role with a steadiness that surprised even herself. The Duke remained near her for most of the evening, not overly attentive in a way that would seem false, but present enough that no one could mistake the understanding between them for mere gossip. When the carriage finally arrived to take her family home, Eleanor sank into the cushioned seat with a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief, replaying the entire evening in her mind. She had walked into the ballroom that night expecting nothing more than another tedious evening of watching other women dance while her mother sighed beside her. She had left it engaged, however temporarily, to the most sought-after man in London, bound by an arrangement built entirely on convenience and shared exhaustion with the demands of society. Her mother could not stop talking the entire ride home, listing the families who would now be forced to treat Eleanor with new respect, imagining the invitations that would surely follow once word of the understanding reached every corner of London. Margaret sat quietly across from her, uncharacteristically subdued, occasionally glancing at Eleanor, with an expression that seemed caught somewhere between surprise and something Eleanor almost mistook for jealousy. It was strange to sit in the same carriage that had carried her to the ball, as the family's quiet disappointment, and ride home, as the center of everyone's attention. Her father said very little until they reached the house, and it was only once her mother and sister had gone ahead into the hallway, still discussing the evening in excited whispers, that he paused beside Eleanor on the front steps and studied her carefully in the lantern light. "Are you certain of this?" he asked quietly, his voice free of the excitement that had filled the rest of the family. A duke does not offer an understanding to a young woman he barely knows, without some reason of his own. I would rather you tell me honestly what that reason is, than have your mother invent one for the both of you. Eleanor considered lying, offering some simple explanation that would ease her father's obvious concern, but something in his steady gaze made her choose honesty instead. "It is an arrangement, Father," she admitted quietly. not a true engagement, not yet. He wished for a reason to avoid the attentions of every ambitious family in London, and I found myself in need of a reason to avoid Mother's constant matchmaking. We agreed it would benefit us both, at least for a time. Her father was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor braced herself for disapproval. Instead, he surprised her with something closer to relief. "Then I am glad it is honest, at least between the two of you," he said. "I have seen enough marriages built on false promises to know how much damage they cause. As long as neither of you enters this pretending it is something it is not, I will not stand in your way. But Eleanor," he added, his voice gentler now, "be careful. Arrangements built on convenience have a way of becoming complicated when feelings are involved. And I suspect a man like the Duke of Ashcombe is not so easily forgotten once you have spent enough time in his company." Eleanor laughed off the warning at the time, certain her father was simply being protective, but his words returned to her later that night as she lay awake staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom, unable to stop thinking about the steady warmth of the Duke's hand around hers on the terrace, or the surprising honesty in his voice when he had spoken of feeling hunted rather than admired. Across the city, in a considerably grander house near the edge of the fashionable district, Lady Charlotte Vane was not sleeping either. She sat before her dressing table long after her maid had gone to bed, staring at her own reflection in the candlelight, replaying the scene at Lady Marchmont's ball again and again in her mind. She had spent the better part of 2 seasons positioning herself carefully in the Duke's circle, attending every event he was known to favor, cultivating friendships with his sisters, ensuring her name was mentioned favorably whenever the subject of his eventual marriage arose among the older matrons who arranged such things. She had been so certain that patience would eventually win him over, that a man as particular as the Duke of Ashcombe would eventually recognize the advantages of a match with a woman as carefully bred and connected as herself. Instead, some plain, unremarkable girl with no fortune to speak of had stumbled into an engagement through nothing more than a careless joke and a stroke of impossible luck. Charlotte's fingers tightened around her hairbrush as she considered the unfairness of it. She had followed every rule society demanded of her, had shaped herself into precisely the kind of wife a man of his standing was supposed to want, and it had earned her nothing but polite indifference. Eleanor Whitmore had followed no rules at all and walked away with exactly what Charlotte had spent years working to achieve. It would not stand, Charlotte decided, setting down her hairbrush with quiet determination. Whatever this understanding truly was, however it had come about, she did not believe for a moment that it was built to last. Arrangements formed in a single reckless evening rarely survived close scrutiny, and Charlotte intended to ensure this one received exactly that kind of attention in the weeks ahead. Back at the Whitmore house, Eleanor finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, unaware of the quiet plans already forming across the city, unaware that her father's gentle warning about complicated feelings was more prophetic than either of them yet understood, and unaware that the ballroom doors that had changed her life so suddenly were only the first of many doors she would have to walk through before the season ended. 3 weeks into the arrangement, Eleanor learned that being envied was far more exhausting than being ignored. She stood at the edge of the Ashworth garden party, a glass of lemonade warming untouched in her hand, watching a group of women who had never once spoken to her before this season, now smiling in her direction with expressions so carefully polite they bordered on hostile. Since the night at Lady Marchmont's ball, Eleanor had become someone entirely new in the eyes of London society. No longer the overlooked younger daughter, but the mysterious young woman who had somehow captured the attention of the Duke of Ashcombe without any of the usual effort such a conquest required. It should have felt like a victory. Instead, it felt like standing in the center of a room full of people waiting for her to fail. "Miss Whitmore," a voice called brightly, and Eleanor turned to find Lady Charlotte Vane approaching with the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. "How fortunate to see you again. I do hope His Grace is treating you well. It must be quite an adjustment, suddenly finding yourself the subject of so much attention." "It has certainly been an adjustment, Lady Charlotte," Eleanor replied evenly, refusing to let the underlying edge in the woman's voice unsettle her outward composure. "Though I find most people have been very kind." Charlotte's smile widened slightly, and Eleanor caught the faint flicker of calculation behind her eyes. "How lovely," Charlotte said. "I only ask because engagements formed so suddenly can sometimes prove difficult to sustain once the initial excitement fades. I would hate to see you disappointed, Miss Whitmore, after everyone has grown so accustomed to seeing you at his side." The comment was delivered with such perfect politeness that Eleanor could not object without appearing oversensitive, yet the meaning beneath the words was unmistakable. Before she could formulate a reply, the Duke appeared at her elbow, having crossed the garden with the quiet efficiency of a man who had noticed trouble from across the lawn, and decided to intervene before it worsened. "Lady Charlotte," he said, inclining his head with perfect courtesy, "I trust you are enjoying the party." Charlotte's expression shifted immediately, warming into something far more genuine, or at least far more practiced, as she turned her attention fully toward him. "Your Grace," she said, "I was just telling Miss Whitmore how delighted I am to see the two of you together, though I confess I am curious how such an unexpected match came about. The stories vary so wildly depending on who tells them." The Duke's expression remained pleasant, but Eleanor noticed a subtle firmness enter his voice, the same quiet steadiness she had heard on the terrace weeks earlier. "The stories vary," he said, "because gossip rarely concerns itself with accuracy, Lady Charlotte. I find the truth considerably less interesting to most people than speculation. If you are curious about the particulars, I would encourage you to ask Miss Whitmore or myself directly, rather than relying on whatever version currently circulates through the drawing rooms of London." Charlotte's smile flickered, just briefly, before settling back into place. "Of course, Your Grace," she said smoothly. "I meant no offense. I simply worry, as any friend of the family would, about arrangements formed so quickly. Marriage is a serious matter, after all, and I would hate to see either of you rush into something neither has fully considered." "Your concern is noted," the Duke said, his tone leaving little room for further discussion. "And I assure you both Miss Whitmore and I have considered our arrangement quite carefully. If you will excuse us, I believe Miss Whitmore promised to walk with me by the roses before the afternoon grows too warm." He offered Eleanor his arm, and she took it gratefully, allowing him to guide her away from Charlotte's watchful gaze toward the quieter path bordering the garden's rosebeds. Once they were far enough from the crowd that conversation felt safe again, Eleanor let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "Thank you for that," she said quietly. "I confess I did not know how to respond to her without seeming rude." "You handled her better than you realize," the Duke replied. "Charlotte Vane has spent 2 seasons perfecting the art of saying cruel things in the most pleasant possible manner. Most people never notice the knife until well after it has already found its mark." "You sound as though you know her well," Eleanor observed. "Well enough to recognize her patterns," he said. "She has made her interest in securing my attention rather clear over the past 2 years, though never quite so directly that I could address it without appearing presumptuous. I imagine our current arrangement has not improved her opinion of either of us." They walked in comfortable silence for a moment, the scent of roses thick around them, and Eleanor found herself studying the Duke's profile with a curiosity she had not expected to feel toward a man she had known for only a few weeks. There was a steadiness to him that surprised her, a willingness to defend her without theatrics or excessive display, simply a quiet insistence on fairness that felt entirely genuine. "May I ask you something?" Eleanor said finally. "Of course." "Do you regret this?" she asked. "Our arrangement, I mean. It has made your life considerably more complicated, if Lady Charlotte's reaction is any indication of how others feel about it." The Duke considered the question seriously before answering, as he seemed to consider most things. "No," he said. "If anything, I find myself less troubled than before, despite the added scrutiny. Before this arrangement, I spent every gathering bracing myself for the next calculated introduction, the next carefully orchestrated conversation designed to showcase some young woman's suitability. Now I attend these events knowing exactly what to expect, and knowing that whatever conversation I have, at least one person in the room will speak to me honestly rather than performing for my benefit." Eleanor felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest at his words, quickly followed by a flicker of confusion at her own reaction. She reminded herself firmly that this was an arrangement built on convenience, nothing more, and that reading too much into his kindness would only lead to disappointment when the season ended, and their understanding quietly dissolved as planned. Still, she found herself asking, "Do you never grow tired of being watched so closely? Every word we exchange seems destined to become gossip within the hour." "I have grown used to it," the Duke admitted, "though I confess it troubles me more on your behalf than my own. You did not choose this life the way I was born into it. You have had scrutiny thrust upon you rather suddenly, and I imagine it must feel overwhelming at times." "It does," Eleanor admitted honestly, "though I find it easier to bear than I expected. Perhaps because for the first time, people are curious about me rather than simply overlooking me entirely. I spent so many years being the daughter nobody noticed that I hardly know how to exist as someone people actually watch." The Duke stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his expression unusually serious. "Anyone who overlooked you before now was not paying proper attention," he said quietly. "I have known you only a few weeks, Miss Whitmore, and I have already seen more genuine wit and honesty from you than I encountered in 2 years of calculated courtship from women far more determined to win my favor." Eleanor's cheeks warmed, and she looked away toward the roses rather than meet his gaze directly, uncertain how to respond to a compliment that felt far more sincere than anything required by their arrangement. Before she could find the right words, a chime rang out from the terrace, signaling that refreshments were being served, and the moment dissolved into the practical business of rejoining the party. That evening, after returning home from the garden party, Eleanor found Margaret waiting in her bedroom, seated on the edge of the bed with an expression that suggested she had been waiting for some time to speak privately. "I saw the way he looked at you today," Margaret said without preamble, watching Eleanor unpin her hair in the mirror. Near the roses, before the refreshments were served, that was not the expression of a man simply maintaining appearances for society's benefit. Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on her own reflection, unwilling to let her sister see whatever might be written across her face. "It is only an arrangement, Margaret," she said. "You know that as well as I do." Margaret rose and crossed the room, taking the hairbrush gently from Eleanor's hands and continuing the task herself, the way she used to when they were younger, and shared a single bedroom before Margaret's marriage. "I know what you have told me the arrangement is," Margaret said quietly. "I am only telling you what I saw. Whatever this began as, Eleanor, I do not think it remains only that any longer, at least not for him, and I suspect, if you were honest with yourself, you would admit the same is becoming true for you." Eleanor's throat tightened, and she found herself unable to argue with her sister's gentle observation. "It frightens me," she admitted quietly, more honestly than she had spoken to anyone since the arrangement began. "If I allow myself to believe this could become something real, and I am wrong, I do not know how I would bear the disappointment. It is easier to remind myself constantly that it will end when the season does." Margaret set down the brush and met her sister's eyes in the mirror's reflection. "Easier perhaps," she said, "but not necessarily wiser. You spent years believing yourself unworthy of being chosen, Eleanor. Do not let that old fear convince you to dismiss something real, simply because it frightens you more than being overlooked ever did." The words stayed with Eleanor long after Margaret had returned to her own room, echoing through her thoughts as she lay awake staring at the same ceiling that had witnessed so many nights of quiet disappointment before this strange season began. The following week brought a formal dinner hosted by the Duke's own family, a considerably more intimate gathering than the sprawling garden parties and crowded ballrooms Eleanor had grown accustomed to navigating. Only a dozen guests had been invited, chosen carefully by the Duke's mother, the Dowager Duchess, a sharp-eyed woman who greeted Eleanor with a politeness that felt more like careful evaluation than genuine warmth. "So you are the young woman who has caused such a stir this season," the Dowager Duchess said, studying Eleanor over the rim of her wineglass as the guests settled at the long dining table. "My son tells me almost nothing about his own affairs, so I confess I have relied entirely on gossip to understand this arrangement of yours." "I hope the gossip has not painted too unflattering a picture, Your Grace," Eleanor replied carefully, aware of every eye at the table now turned toward their exchange. The Dowager Duchess's expression remained unreadable for a long moment, before something almost like approval flickered across her sharp features. "Gossip rarely paints accurate pictures of anything," she said. "I prefer to form my own judgments. And from what I have observed this evening, Miss Whitmore, you do not flinch easily under scrutiny. That is a rarer quality than you might realize, particularly among women who suddenly find themselves the subject of London's undivided attention." The dinner continued more comfortably after that initial exchange, though Eleanor remained acutely aware of the Dowager Duchess's watchful presence throughout the evening, noting how the older woman observed every interaction between Eleanor and her son with careful, unhurried attention. When the meal concluded and the guests began retiring to the drawing room, the Dowager Duchess drew Eleanor aside briefly, away from the others. "Whatever this arrangement truly is between you and my son," she said quietly, "I will tell you what I have not yet told him. He has not smiled so easily in company since before his father died and left him this title he never wanted. Whether that is your doing or simply fortunate timing, I cannot say. But I would advise you to consider carefully what you are willing to lose if this arrangement ends as quietly as it apparently began." Eleanor had no response ready for such a direct observation, and the Dowager Duchess did not seem to expect one, moving away to rejoin her other guests before Eleanor could formulate any reply at all. Over the following days, Eleanor began noticing small changes in how the Duke behaved toward her, subtle shifts that had nothing to do with maintaining appearances for society's benefit. He began seeking her opinion on matters entirely unrelated to their arrangement, asking what she thought of certain books, certain political questions of the day, certain philosophical debates that seemed to genuinely interest him. He remembered small details she mentioned only once in passing, referencing them again days later, in ways that suggested he had actually been listening rather than simply performing polite attention. Eleanor found herself looking forward to their arranged meetings with an eagerness that unsettled her more each time she noticed it. She reminded herself repeatedly that their understanding was temporary, built on mutual convenience rather than genuine affection. Yet the reminder grew harder to believe with each conversation that stretched longer than necessary, each smile that seemed to come more easily between them. Meanwhile, Lady Charlotte Vane had not abandoned her quiet campaign of doubt. Eleanor began hearing whispers wherever she went, carefully planted questions about the suddenness of the engagement, pointed comments about how convenient it seemed that a penniless young woman had managed to secure such a fortunate match through nothing more than a careless joke. Charlotte never attached her own name directly to these rumors, always careful to phrase her doubts as concern rather than accusation, but Eleanor recognized the pattern well enough by now to know exactly where they originated. Her mother, initially thrilled by the social advantages of the match, grew increasingly anxious as the whispers persisted. "Eleanor, are you certain there is nothing improper in this arrangement?" she asked one evening, wringing her hands as she paced the small parlor of their home. "People are beginning to ask questions I do not know how to answer. If this understanding falls apart publicly, the damage to your reputation, to all our reputations, could be considerable." Eleanor had begun to notice the whispers taking a sharper shape in recent days. No longer vague murmurs about the suddenness of the match, but pointed suggestions that she had somehow engineered the entire situation for her own benefit. A woman she barely recognized had stopped her outside a milliner's shop only that morning, asking with false sweetness whether it was true that Eleanor's family had been in financial difficulty before the engagement, and whether that difficulty had perhaps inspired her famous joke rather more than pure spontaneity might suggest. Eleanor had denied it as calmly as she could manage, but the encounter left her shaken for the rest of the day, aware that Charlotte's careful campaign was growing bolder with each passing week. "It will not fall apart, Mother," Eleanor said, though privately she felt far less certain than her words suggested. Whatever else was true about her arrangement with the Duke, she had begun to suspect that the greatest danger to it was not Charlotte's whispers or society's scrutiny, but the growing, unwelcome realization that she no longer wished for their understanding to remain merely practical. That realization frightened her more than any rumor Charlotte could invent, because an arrangement built on convenience could end without consequence, but feelings, once allowed to take root, rarely disappeared so easily when the season concluded and reality reasserted itself. She was still turning that fear over in her mind late one evening when a note arrived at the Whitmore house, sealed with the Duke's own crest, requesting her presence at a private matter the following afternoon. Eleanor read the brief message 3 times, searching for some hint of its purpose, before finally setting it aside with hands that trembled slightly more than she would have liked to admit. Whatever waited for her tomorrow, she suspected the comfortable boundaries of their arrangement were about to be tested in ways neither of them had anticipated when they first shook hands on the terrace. First, the letter arrived at the Whitmore house on a gray Tuesday morning, and by nightfall, Eleanor's entire world had begun to crumble. She had spent the day preparing for the Duke's private request, wondering what matter had prompted such formality between them, when her mother burst into the parlor with a folded paper clutched in trembling hands, her face drained of all color. "Eleanor, what is this?" her mother demanded, thrusting the paper toward her. "It arrived not an hour ago, delivered by a boy who would not say who sent it. Read it. Tell me this is not true." Eleanor unfolded the paper with growing dread, and found herself staring at what appeared to be a letter written in her own hand, addressed to an unnamed correspondent, describing in careful detail a scheme to trap the Duke of Ashcombe into marriage through a carefully staged joke, timed precisely to coincide with his arrival at Lady Marchmont's ball. The handwriting was close enough to her own that Eleanor's stomach turned as she read it, though she knew with absolute certainty she had never written a single word of it. "This is false," Eleanor said, her voice shaking despite her effort to remain calm. "Mother, I swear to you, I never wrote this. I do not even know who could have crafted something so convincing." Her mother sank into the nearest chair, pressing a hand to her chest as though struggling to breathe. "It does not matter whether it is true," she whispered. "It matters who has seen it, and how many more copies exist beyond this one. If this reaches the wrong hands, Eleanor, if this reaches the Duke's family, we are ruined, not just you, all of us." Eleanor read the forged letter again, searching for some clue as to its origin, though she already suspected she knew exactly who had crafted it. The careful cruelty of it, the precise timing, the way it painted her not as a foolish girl caught in an unexpected circumstance, but as a calculating schemer who had planned every moment of that fateful evening, bore all the hallmarks of someone who had studied her closely enough to imitate her voice convincingly. Only one person in London had both the motive and the opportunity to construct such a thing. Charlotte, Eleanor breathed, the name settling into place with sickening certainty. You cannot make such an accusation without proof, her mother said sharply, fear making her voice brittle. If you accuse Lady Charlotte Vane of forgery and cannot prove it, you will only confirm every suspicion this letter already raises. We must think carefully before acting, Eleanor. One wrong step now could destroy everything. The following days passed in a haze of quiet dread. Eleanor learned that the letter had not remained a single copy delivered only to her family. Whispers reached her that similar copies, or perhaps simply detailed descriptions of its contents, had begun circulating among the very families who had once eagerly welcomed her into their drawing rooms. Invitations that had arrived regularly since the engagement began now slowed to a trickle. Women who had smiled at her with careful politeness only weeks earlier now found reasons to avoid her entirely, whispering behind fans as she passed. Eleanor had not seen the Duke since the letter arrived, uncertain how to face him with such a damaging accusation hanging over her, uncertain whether he too had received a copy, and was simply choosing his response carefully before confronting her directly. The uncertainty gnawed at her more painfully than any of Charlotte's earlier, subtler cruelties had managed. When his note finally arrived, requesting she call upon him at his townhouse rather than meeting in some public garden or ballroom, Eleanor's hands shook so badly she could barely fold the paper back into its envelope. She arrived to find him waiting in a private study lined with tall shelves of leather-bound books, his expression grave in a way she had not seen since the night of the ball. A copy of the forged letter sat on the desk between them, and Eleanor felt her heart drop at the sight of it. "You have seen it then," she said quietly, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. "I have," he said. "It arrived yesterday, delivered anonymously as yours apparently was. I have spent the last day attempting to determine its origin before speaking with you, because I did not wish to accuse you unfairly of something I had not properly investigated." "And what have you concluded?" Eleanor asked, bracing herself for whatever answer might follow. The Duke's expression softened slightly, though the gravity in his eyes remained. "I do not believe you wrote this," he said. "The handwriting is close enough to fool a casual observer, but I have received enough correspondence from you now to notice the differences. Your letters slant slightly to the left near the end of each word. Whoever forged this did not study your hand closely enough to catch that detail." Relief flooded through Eleanor so suddenly her knees nearly buckled, and she gripped the back of the nearest chair to steady herself. "Thank you," she whispered. "I feared you might believe I had truly deceived you from the very beginning." "I know you too well now to believe that so easily," he said, "though I confess the accusation has caused considerable difficulty regardless of its truth. My family has received pointed questions from several quarters. Certain political allies I depend upon have begun asking whether this scandal might reflect poorly on my judgment, whether a more carefully chosen match might serve my interests better than one clouded by such public doubt." Eleanor's chest tightened at the implication behind his words. "And what have you told them?" she asked quietly. "I have told them the truth, as I understand it," he said. "But truth does not always travel as quickly or as convincingly as scandal, Miss Whitmore. I will not pretend this situation is simple to navigate, particularly given the pressures my position carries. There are those within my own circle who believe I should end our arrangement quietly now, before the damage grows any worse." The words landed like a physical blow, and Eleanor found herself unable to speak for a long moment, staring at the forged letter still resting on the desk between them, the careful cruelty of its construction now feeling like the opening move in a much larger game she had never asked to play. "Is that what you intend to do?" she finally managed to ask, forcing herself to meet his eyes despite the fear tightening in her chest. The Duke was quiet for a long moment before answering, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a certainty that surprised her. "No," he said simply. "I do not intend to abandon you because someone found it convenient to attack your character through forgery, but I will not pretend the coming days will be easy, Eleanor. Whoever crafted this letter clearly intends to see our understanding destroyed, and I suspect they will not stop with a single attempt." It was the first time he had used her given name without the formal address that had governed every previous conversation between them, and Eleanor felt the shift settle over her like something significant, something that had quietly changed between them without either of them announcing it aloud. "I believe I know who is responsible," Eleanor said carefully, "though my mother warns me against making accusations I cannot prove." "Your mother offers wise counsel," the Duke said. "Accusations without evidence will only strengthen whatever narrative Charlotte Vane, if it is indeed her, hopes to construct around you. We must be patient and careful if we intend to expose the truth without destroying your reputation in the process. That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor sat by her window watching the quiet street below, turning the events of the past week over in her mind. She thought of the careful cruelty required to forge a letter convincing enough to fool her own mother, the patience it must have taken to study her handwriting closely enough to attempt an imitation, and the coldness required to send such a thing anonymously, without ever having to face the damage it caused directly. She thought, too, of Charlotte Vane's carefully composed smile at every gathering since the engagement began, the polite concern that always seemed to carry a hidden blade beneath its surface, and wondered how long the woman had been planning something so deliberate. It could not have been a sudden decision, born only of that first shock at Lady Marchmont's ball. Whoever had written that letter had clearly spent weeks preparing it, waiting for the right moment to release it into circulation, choosing a time when Eleanor's position felt secure enough that its impact would be most devastating. The following afternoon, Eleanor encountered Charlotte quite by accident outside a bookshop on a fashionable street, and though every instinct urged her to walk past without acknowledgement, something in her refused to retreat as she once might have. She stopped instead, meeting Charlotte's cool gaze directly. "Lady Charlotte," Eleanor said, keeping her voice carefully even, "I understand a rather unpleasant letter has been circulating this week, one claiming to reveal my supposed scheme to trap the Duke into marriage. I wonder if you have heard anything about its origin." Charlotte's expression remained perfectly composed, though something flickered briefly behind her eyes, too quick to name with certainty. "How troubling," she said smoothly. "Forgeries of that nature are always so distasteful. I do hope you find whoever is responsible, Miss Whitmore. Such cruelty should not go unanswered." "I intend to find them," Eleanor said, holding Charlotte's gaze without flinching. "And when I do, I intend to make certain everyone in London understands exactly what kind of person would stoop to such deception, simply because they could not accept losing something they never truly possessed." For just a moment, Charlotte's careful mask slipped, a flash of genuine anger crossing her features before she smoothed it away again beneath practiced composure. "I wish you luck in your investigation," she said, her voice noticeably cooler now, "though I would caution you against making accusations you cannot prove. Such things have a way of damaging the accuser as much as the accused, particularly when the accuser already carries a reputation as fragile as yours currently does." The threat, thinly veiled beneath polite phrasing, confirmed everything Eleanor had already suspected, though she knew her mother was right that suspicion alone would not be enough to expose Charlotte publicly. She would need proof, something undeniable that could not be dismissed as mere speculation or jealousy between rivals. "Good day, Lady Charlotte," Eleanor said finally, inclining her head with cool politeness before continuing on her way, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and unfamiliar determination. She relayed the encounter to the Duke that same evening, describing Charlotte's veiled threat and the brief flash of anger that had betrayed her composure. The Duke listened carefully, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "That confirms what I already suspected," he said once Eleanor finished. "Though as your mother rightly warned, suspicion will not be sufficient to clear your name publicly. We need evidence linking her directly to the letter, something that cannot be explained away as coincidence or misfortune." "I have an idea," Eleanor said slowly, an idea that had been forming since her encounter outside the bookshop. "If Charlotte studied my handwriting closely enough to forge it, she must have obtained a genuine sample somewhere, perhaps from a mutual acquaintance, or perhaps she requested something in writing from me directly at some point this season without my realizing her true purpose." The Duke's eyes sharpened with interest. "Do you recall any such request?" he asked. Eleanor thought carefully, working backward through the weeks since the ball, until a memory surfaced that made her breath catch. "At the Ashworth garden party," she said. "Charlotte asked me to write a brief note to her modiste, recommending a particular ribbon color I had mentioned admiring. I thought nothing of it at the time, but if she kept that note rather than passing it along as claimed, it would give her exactly the sample she needed to study my hand." Over the following days, Eleanor found herself drawn into a strange, quiet partnership with the Duke, the two of them carefully comparing notes on who might have delivered the letters, who possessed sufficient familiarity with Eleanor's handwriting to attempt such a convincing forgery, and who stood to benefit most from seeing their engagement collapse under the weight of manufactured scandal. Every thread they pulled seemed to lead back toward the same careful, calculating woman who had watched Eleanor with cold, polite interest since the very first garden party. Meanwhile, Eleanor's family grew increasingly desperate as the whispers continued to spread unchecked through London's drawing rooms. Her mother began urging her, with growing insistence, to end the arrangement herself before any further damage could be done, arguing that a quiet, dignified withdrawal now would preserve at least some remnant of the family's reputation, while continuing to fight a battle they might not win, risked losing everything entirely. "I cannot simply walk away," Eleanor told her mother one tense evening, her voice firmer than she had intended, not because of pride, but because walking away now would mean accepting a lie as truth. "I did not scheme my way into this arrangement, and I will not let someone else's cruelty convince the entire city otherwise while I quietly disappear from view." Her mother did not argue further, though the worry etched into her face remained, and Eleanor understood that the coming weeks would demand a courage she had never before been asked to summon, not simply to defend her reputation, but to defend the fragile, unexpected possibility of something real that had grown quietly between herself and the Duke since that first strange night on the terrace. Whatever Charlotte Vane intended next, Eleanor resolved she would not face it as the same quiet, overlooked woman who had once hidden at the edges of every ballroom. That woman, she realized with growing certainty, no longer existed, and whoever had tried to destroy her with a forged letter would soon discover exactly how much had changed. The invitation to Lady Pemberton's grand assembly arrived 3 days later, and Eleanor knew immediately that it would provide the setting neither she nor the Duke had dared hope for so soon. Lady Pemberton's gatherings were legendary for drawing nearly every prominent family in London, a stage far larger than any garden party or intimate dinner, and Eleanor understood without needing to be told that if Charlotte's scheme was to be exposed, this crowded, glittering assembly offered the perfect opportunity. The Duke had spent the days since Eleanor's discovery quietly gathering what evidence he could, calling upon the modiste Charlotte claimed to have delivered the note to, only to learn, exactly as Eleanor suspected, that no such note had ever arrived at the shop. The modiste, a sharp-eyed woman who valued her reputation for discretion, had initially hesitated to speak against a client as influential as Lady Charlotte Vane, but the Duke's quiet, patient questioning, combined with his willingness to compensate her generously for the risk, eventually produced a written statement confirming that she had received no such note that season, from Eleanor or anyone else on Charlotte's behalf. "It is not absolute proof," the Duke admitted, presenting the statement to Eleanor in his study the evening before the assembly. "But combined with Charlotte's reaction when you confronted her outside the bookshop, and the fact that she alone among your acquaintances requested a sample of your handwriting under a false pretense, I believe it will be enough to raise serious doubt about her innocence, particularly if we present it publicly rather than allowing her to dismiss it privately." Eleanor studied the statement carefully, her stomach tight with nervous anticipation. "And if this is not enough," she asked, "if she manages to explain it away somehow, in front of everyone, then we will have lost nothing we did not already risk losing regardless," the Duke said steadily. "Your reputation is already under threat from a lie neither of us created. I would rather fight for the truth publicly than watch that lie continue to spread unchallenged, simply because confronting it carries risk." Eleanor admired his steadiness, though privately she felt far less certain of the outcome than his calm words suggested. She had spent so many years avoiding attention, retreating quietly to the edges of every room rather than risk being seen and found wanting, and the thought of standing at the center of Lady Pemberton's crowded ballroom, publicly defending herself against Charlotte's carefully constructed lies, filled her with a fear unlike anything she had experienced before. Yet beneath that fear, something else had begun to take root over the past difficult weeks, a quiet determination that surprised her each time she noticed it. She was tired of being spoken about rather than speaking for herself, tired of allowing other people, whether cruel rivals or well-meaning family, to decide what her silence meant and what her future should look like. Whatever happened at Lady Pemberton's assembly, Eleanor resolved she would not stand silently while others determined her fate around her. The evening of the assembly arrived with a clear sky and unseasonable warmth, and Eleanor dressed with careful attention, choosing a gown of deep blue that her mother had insisted made her look every bit as elegant as any duchess. Margaret helped arrange her hair, her hands steady despite the nervous energy radiating from both sisters as they prepared for what might prove to be the most important evening of Eleanor's young life. "You look every bit as strong as you feel," Margaret said quietly, meeting Eleanor's eyes in the mirror. "Whatever happens tonight, remember that you have already survived weeks of whispers and doubt without losing yourself entirely. That is no small accomplishment, Eleanor, whatever the outcome tonight brings." The carriage ride to Lady Pemberton's residence felt longer than any journey Eleanor had taken all season, each turn of the wheels carrying her closer to a confrontation she had spent days both dreading and preparing for in equal measure. She watched the familiar streets of London pass by the window, rehearsing in her mind the words she might need. though she suspected no amount of preparation could fully ready her for whatever Charlotte might say in response, or however the watching crowd might ultimately judge the exchange. The ballroom at Lady Pemberton's residence glittered with candlelight and crowded conversation when Eleanor arrived, easily twice the size of Lady Marchmont's gathering months earlier, filled with nearly every family whose opinion had mattered so much to Eleanor since her engagement began. She spotted the Duke near the entrance, waiting for her with an expression of quiet reassurance that steadied her nerves slightly as she crossed the room to join him. Before they could move further into the crowd, Eleanor's mother appeared at her side, her face tight with anxious energy, having clearly heard some version of the evening's plan from Margaret earlier that day. "Eleanor, please reconsider," her mother whispered urgently, glancing nervously around the crowded room. "If this confrontation fails, if Lady Charlotte manages to twist the accusation back upon you, we will have nowhere left to retreat. Your father and I have discussed it at length, and while we support you, I confess I have not slept properly in days worrying over what tonight might bring." Eleanor took her mother's trembling hands and held them firmly, feeling for the first time as though their roles had somehow reversed, as though she were the one now offering reassurance rather than receiving it. "I understand your fear, Mother," she said gently. "I have felt it too, every night this week, but I would rather risk everything tonight, standing on the truth, than spend the rest of my life quietly enduring whispers I never gave myself the chance to answer. Whatever happens, I need you to trust that I have thought this through carefully." Her mother searched her face for a long moment before nodding slowly, releasing a shaky breath. "You have grown so much these past weeks," she murmured, something like wonder mixing with her lingering worry. "I hardly recognize the frightened girl who joked so carelessly at Lady Marchmont's ball." "Perhaps that girl needed to disappear for this one to emerge," Eleanor said, offering her mother a small, steadying smile before turning back toward the Duke, who had waited patiently a few steps away throughout the exchange. "Charlotte will be here tonight," he said quietly once they resumed walking, his voice carrying only for Eleanor's benefit. "I have confirmed her attendance already. We simply need to find the right moment." They did not have long to wait. Within the hour, Eleanor spotted Charlotte across the ballroom, resplendent in pale silver silk, holding court among a cluster of admiring young women who seemed to hang on her every word. Charlotte caught sight of Eleanor and the Duke approaching, and her expression shifted subtly, composure sliding into place like armor, though Eleanor now recognized the brief flicker of wariness beneath it. "Lady Charlotte," the Duke said, his voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of those standing nearby without appearing to announce anything deliberately. "I wonder if you might clarify something for us. Miss Whitmore mentioned recently that she wrote a note to your modiste at your request, recommending a ribbon color for your consideration. Yet when I called upon the shop myself, the modiste had no record of any such note ever arriving." A ripple of curious attention spread through the nearby guests, conversations pausing as people began to notice the tension building around the small group. Charlotte's smile remained fixed, though Eleanor watched her eyes dart briefly toward the exit, before returning to the Duke's steady gaze. "How strange," Charlotte said, her voice slightly higher than her usual practiced tone. "Perhaps the note was lost, or perhaps the modiste simply forgot to record it properly. Such things happen more often than one might expect." "Perhaps," the Duke agreed evenly. "Though it does raise an interesting question, given that a forged letter recently circulated through London, one written in a hand closely imitating Miss Whitmore's own, describing a scheme she never devised. I find myself wondering how someone might acquire a convincing sample of another person's handwriting, if not through a request such as the one you made for that note." The crowd around them had grown noticeably larger now, drawn by the unmistakable tension crackling beneath the polite exchange, and Eleanor felt every eye in the vicinity turning toward Charlotte, waiting for her response. Charlotte's composure finally began to crack visibly, a flush of anger rising in her cheeks despite her obvious effort to maintain her practiced calm. "I do not appreciate the implication, Your Grace," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. "If you are suggesting I had some hand in forging a letter, I would remind you that such an accusation, made without proof, could damage your own reputation as easily as mine." This was the moment Eleanor had been dreading and preparing for in equal measure, and she felt her heart pounding as she stepped forward, no longer content to let the Duke carry the confrontation alone. She had spent weeks being discussed, defended, and doubted by others, and she was tired of standing silently while her own fate was decided around her. "I have proof enough for my own satisfaction, Lady Charlotte," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she expected as every conversation nearby fell silent to listen. "I know my own handwriting well enough to recognize the differences in that forged letter, subtle as they were. I know that you alone, among everyone I have spoken with this season, requested a sample of my hand under a pretense that has now proven false. And I know that you have made your resentment toward this arrangement clear from the very first evening it began, however carefully you have tried to disguise it since. Charlotte's mouth opened, then closed again, her carefully constructed composure finally abandoning her entirely, as the surrounding crowd watched with open fascination. You cannot prove any of that, she said, though her voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. Perhaps not to the satisfaction of a courtroom, Eleanor agreed. But I do not need to prove it to a courtroom, Lady Charlotte. I only need every person in this room tonight to understand exactly what kind of woman would forge another person's handwriting in an attempt to destroy a reputation she envied. I suspect that understanding will spread through London considerably faster than your original letter ever managed to. A murmur swept through the crowd, and Eleanor caught sight of several women who had distanced themselves from her in recent weeks, now watching Charlotte with newly skeptical expressions, weighing this fresh accusation against everything they had previously believed. Charlotte glanced around at the gathered faces, clearly recognizing the shift in the room's sympathy, and for a moment, Eleanor thought she might simply retreat rather than respond further. Instead, Charlotte's expression hardened into something colder, more desperate. You think yourself so clever, standing there defending your stolen position, she hissed, her careful facade finally shattering entirely under the weight of public scrutiny. Do you truly believe you deserve him, Eleanor Whitmore? A man of his standing, choosing a woman with no fortune, no true connections, nothing to offer beyond a lucky joke at exactly the right moment. The venom in Charlotte's voice drew gasps from several onlookers, the naked jealousy finally impossible to disguise beneath any pretense of polite concern. Eleanor felt something steady settle within her chest, a calm certainty that had been building slowly since that first frightened night on the terrace weeks earlier. I do not know what I deserve, Lady Charlotte, Eleanor said quietly, though her voice carried clearly across the now silent ballroom. I only know that whatever exists between the Duke and myself was never something I schemed to acquire. It grew from honesty, however accidentally it began. You, meanwhile, spent 2 years calculating every move you made toward him, and when that calculation failed, you chose cruelty rather than accepting that some things cannot be won through careful strategy alone. The Duke stepped forward then, his expression grave as he addressed the crowd directly for the first time since the confrontation began. I believe we have all heard enough this evening to draw our own conclusions, he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being heated. I will leave it to each of you to decide what to make of tonight's events. But I will say plainly that Miss Whitmore has shown more honesty and courage in these past weeks than I have witnessed from anyone else in this room, myself included. Charlotte, recognizing the battle thoroughly lost, turned and fled through the parting crowd without another word, her silver gown catching the candlelight one final time before she disappeared through the ballroom's tall doors. The silence she left behind slowly filled with murmuring conversation, dozens of guests already reshaping the story they would carry home that night, though this time, Eleanor suspected, the story would finally favor the truth. Eleanor turned to find the Duke watching her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something warmer and more open than the careful composure he usually maintained in public. You did not need my defense tonight, he said quietly, once the immediate crowd had begun to disperse back into their earlier conversations. You handled her entirely on your own. I had a great deal of help reaching this moment, Eleanor replied, though something had shifted within her as well. A confidence she had never quite possessed before tonight, settling comfortably into place. But I needed to speak for myself, finally. I have spent too many years letting other people's opinions decide who I was allowed to be. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them that felt far more significant than anything required by their original arrangement. I find, he said slowly, that I no longer wish for this to remain merely an understanding, Eleanor. I have wished it for some weeks now, if I am honest, though I did not know how to say so without risking everything we had built together. Eleanor's heart pounded as she searched his face for any hint of uncertainty and found none. Around them, the ballroom had gradually returned to its usual rhythm of music and conversation, though Eleanor noticed a new warmth in the glances now directed her way, a subtle but unmistakable shift from cautious curiosity to something closer to genuine respect. Several women who had kept their distance in recent weeks now approached with quiet apologies, admitting they had allowed Charlotte's careful whispers to shape their judgment without ever questioning the source. Eleanor accepted each apology graciously, though she found she no longer needed their approval the way she once might have, having discovered over these difficult weeks that her own steady sense of herself mattered far more than the shifting opinions of a crowded room. Her father found her near the edge of the dance floor some time later, his expression carrying the same quiet pride Eleanor remembered from her childhood. On the rare occasions she had earned it through her own effort rather than simple good fortune. "I believe I owe you an apology," he said, his voice unusually thick with emotion. "I warned you weeks ago that arrangements built on convenience grow complicated when feelings become involved. I never imagined you would face that complication with such courage, nor that you would emerge from it so entirely yourself." "You did not need to apologize, Father," Eleanor said, embracing him warmly. "Your warning helped me understand what I was risking, and prepared me to face it honestly when the moment finally arrived. Then perhaps," she said softly, "we should stop pretending this was ever only convenient." Spring had fully settled over London by the time the Duke of Ashcombe requested Eleanor's presence at Lady Marchmont's ballroom once more, and Eleanor felt the strange symmetry of it the moment her carriage pulled up before those same tall doors that had changed her entire life months earlier. She had not expected to return here so soon, and certainly not at the Duke's specific request, delivered through a note that revealed nothing of his intentions beyond asking her to wear the same deep blue gown she had chosen for Lady Pemberton's assembly weeks before. The mystery of it had occupied her thoughts for days, though her mother, who seemed to know considerably more than she was willing to share, had done nothing but smile knowingly whenever Eleanor pressed for details. The weeks since Charlotte Vane's public unmasking had transformed Eleanor's position in society almost as dramatically as that first careless joke once had, though this time the transformation carried none of the earlier uncertainty. Charlotte herself had quietly withdrawn from London entirely, retreating to her family's country estate under the polite fiction of ill health, and few among the ton seemed inclined to question the timing too closely. Eleanor had heard nothing further from her since that final furious exchange, and found she felt no particular satisfaction in Charlotte's disgrace, only a quiet relief that the truth had finally been allowed to stand on its own. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor and the Duke had continued seeing one another with a warmth that no longer required any pretense of arrangement or convenience. Their conversations grew longer, their letters more frequent, and Eleanor found herself looking forward to each meeting with an eagerness she no longer bothered to disguise or explain away. The Dowager Duchess had taken to inviting Eleanor to tea with increasing regularity, their earlier careful evaluation gradually softening into something resembling genuine affection, and even Margaret had remarked more than once that she had never seen her sister so entirely herself. Yet despite these months of growing closeness, the Duke had said nothing further about the future beyond their current understanding, and Eleanor had not pressed him, sensing instinctively that whatever came next would arrive in its own time, shaped by his own careful consideration rather than any impatience on her part. She had spent many quiet evenings during those weeks reflecting on how completely her circumstances had changed since that first reckless joke, where once she had dreaded every gathering, certain she would spend the evening watching from the edges while others danced. She now found herself genuinely welcomed wherever she went, greeted by name, asked her opinion on matters both trivial and serious. It was not simply the Duke's attention that had transformed her standing, though she understood that had certainly played its part. It was the confidence she had discovered within herself during those difficult weeks of scandal and doubt, a steadiness that remained with her even now, long after Charlotte's threat had faded into memory. Her father, too, had changed in his own quiet way, no longer watching her with the worried uncertainty that had once colored so many of their conversations. He spoke to her now as an equal, asking her thoughts on matters he once would have reserved for discussion with Margaret's husband alone, and Eleanor treasured this new closeness perhaps more than any of society's renewed warmth toward her. Now, standing once again before the doors of Lady Marchmont's ballroom, Eleanor smoothed the skirt of her blue gown and allowed the footman to escort her inside, her heart beating with a mixture of curiosity and anticipation she could not quite name. The ballroom looked much as it had that first fateful evening, candlelight glittering across polished floors, though considerably fewer guests occupied the space this time, gathered in small clusters near the edges of the room rather than filling it entirely. Eleanor recognized many familiar faces among them, her own family standing near the front, Margaret beaming beside their parents, the Dowager Duchess seated with quiet dignity nearby, and scattered among the crowd, several of the very women who had once doubted Eleanor most fiercely now watching with open curiosity rather than judgment. At the center of the room, near the very spot where Eleanor had once made her careless joke, stood the Duke of Ashcombe, dressed in the same dark blue that had first stopped every conversation in this ballroom months earlier. He watched her approach with an expression of such open warmth that Eleanor felt her earlier nervousness dissolve almost entirely, replaced by a steady, certain happiness she had never quite allowed herself to expect. "You asked me to wear this gown again," Eleanor said as she reached him, glancing around at the gathered crowd with growing curiosity. "I confess I do not fully understand the occasion, Your Grace." The Duke's mouth curved into a smile that reached his eyes fully. None of the careful composure he had once maintained so consistently in public. "I wanted to bring you back to where this began," he said. "Not the version of this room filled with strangers and gossip and misunderstanding, but this room, with the people who matter most to both of us gathered, to witness what I hope will become the truth of it, rather than merely the beginning of a story neither of us planned." Eleanor's breath caught as understanding began to dawn, and she watched, heart pounding, as the Duke lowered himself onto one knee before her, drawing gentle gasps and quiet murmurs of delight from the small gathered crowd. "Eleanor Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly hushed ballroom. "Months ago, I walked through those doors expecting nothing more than another tedious evening, and found instead a woman brave enough to laugh at her own circumstances, honest enough to admit an embarrassing truth rather than hide behind convenient silence, and strong enough to stand alone against cruelty when everyone else might have simply retreated. What began between us as convenience became, without my fully realizing it until it was already true, the truest and most important thing in my life. I am not proposing this time to shield either of us from society's expectations. I am proposing because I cannot imagine building the rest of my life beside anyone other than you." Eleanor felt tears gathering as she looked down at him. This man who had once seemed so unreachable, so burdened by the very title that had first frightened her when he walked through those doors, now kneeling before her with nothing but open, unguarded hope written across his face. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with happiness rather than fear this time. "Yes, entirely, and truly yes." The ballroom erupted into applause and delighted exclamations as the Duke rose and gathered her into an embrace, and Eleanor caught sight of her mother weeping openly with joy, her father's proud smile, Margaret laughing and clapping despite her own tears, and the Dowager Duchess watching the scene with quiet satisfaction, as though everything had unfolded exactly as she had privately hoped from that very first dinner months earlier. In the days that followed, news of the genuine engagement spread through London with far greater warmth than the original rumor ever had, carried not by scandal or speculation but by the simple, undeniable truth that everyone who witnessed that evening had seen something entirely real pass between them. Invitations flooded the Whitmore household once more, though Eleanor found she cared far less about the social advantages now than she once might have, having learned through months of difficulty that genuine happiness required considerably less validation from crowded ballrooms than she had once believed. Her mother, predictably, threw herself into wedding preparations with an enthusiasm that left little room for anyone else's opinion, though Eleanor found she did not mind nearly as much as she once might have, understanding now that her mother's anxious matchmaking had always come from a place of genuine, if sometimes overwhelming, love. Margaret became an invaluable ally throughout the preparations, offering practical advice drawn from her own wedding the previous year, and the two sisters grew closer during those months than they had been since childhood. The old rivalry and comparison finally dissolved entirely into genuine affection. One evening, as the wedding preparations neared completion, Eleanor found her father waiting for her in the small study he rarely used, a glass of wine untouched on the desk before him. He had asked to speak with her privately, and something in his expression suggested the conversation had been weighing on him for some time. "I never told you how proud I was of you, that evening at Lady Pemberton's assembly," he admitted, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show so openly. "I stood at the edge of that crowd, watching you defend yourself with more courage than I possessed at your age, and I understood then that I had perhaps spent too many years worrying over whether you would be chosen by someone, rather than recognizing that you had always been entirely capable of choosing for yourself." Eleanor crossed the room and embraced him tightly, unable to find words adequate to the moment. "You gave me the foundation to find that courage, Father," she said finally. "Whatever strength I found that night, I learned much of it from watching you and Mother weather your own difficulties together over the years." Her father held her for a long moment before releasing her. His eyes bright with unshed tears, he quickly blinked away, returning to his usual composed manner as he lifted his wineglass in a small private toast. "To the woman you have become," he said simply, and Eleanor carried the warmth of that quiet moment with her through all the busy preparations that followed. The wedding itself took place on a bright morning in early summer, held not in the grandest cathedral London could offer, but in a smaller, more intimate chapel that the Duke had chosen specifically because Eleanor had once mentioned admiring its simple architecture during one of their many long conversations. She wore a gown of pale ivory rather than the deep blue that had become so significant between them, though she kept a small ribbon of that same blue tucked discreetly into her bouquet, a private acknowledgement of the strange, unexpected path that had brought her to this moment. As Eleanor walked down the narrow aisle toward the man waiting for her, she caught sight of familiar faces scattered among the modest gathering, her family beaming with unrestrained joy, the Dowager Duchess dabbing at her eyes with obvious emotion despite her usually composed demeanor, and even a scattering of women who had once doubted her most fiercely now smiling with what appeared to be genuine happiness at witnessing such an unlikely, hard-won romance finally reach its conclusion. The Duke watched her approach with the same open warmth he had shown that night in Lady Marchmont's ballroom, and Eleanor felt, walking toward him, that she was not simply marrying a duke, or securing the kind of match her family had once despaired she would never achieve, but choosing, freely and entirely, the one person who had seen her clearly from that very first embarrassing moment, and never once looked away. When the ceremony concluded and they emerged from the chapel as husband and wife, Eleanor paused for a moment on the chapel steps, looking out at the small crowd gathered to celebrate with them, and found herself thinking back to that careless joke spoken months earlier in a crowded ballroom, never imagining for a moment that such a small, thoughtless declaration would lead her to this exact place, standing beside a man who had taught her that being truly seen was worth every uncertain risk it required. "I will marry the next man who enters," she had teased that night, never expecting the words to carry any real weight. Yet somehow, impossibly, they had led her here, to a life built not on convenience or careless chance, but on the steady, hard-earned foundation of two people who had chosen, again and again, through every difficult month between that first accidental meeting and this final joyful morning, to be honest with each other, when honesty was far easier to avoid. The wedding breakfast that followed was a warm, joyful affair held in the gardens of the Duke's country house, tables set beneath blossoming trees while a small orchestra played softly in the background. Eleanor moved through the gathering on her husband's arm, accepting congratulations from guests old and new, pausing frequently to embrace family members who had supported her through every difficult turn of the past months. Her father rose partway through the celebration to offer a toast, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his expression. "To my daughter," he said, raising his glass toward Eleanor, who once believed herself overlooked, and who taught this entire family that being seen clearly matters far more than being seen often. And to her husband, who proved himself worthy of her not through title or fortune, but through the simple, difficult choice to stand beside her, when standing beside her was not the easiest path available to him. The guests raised their glasses in warm agreement, and Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes once more, overwhelmed by the accumulated weight of everything that had led to this bright, joyful afternoon. The Dowager Duchess, seated near the head of the table, caught Eleanor's eye, and offered a small, knowing smile, a silent acknowledgement of the conversation they had shared so many months earlier at that first formal dinner, when she had warned Eleanor to consider carefully what she was willing to lose. Later, as the afternoon light softened toward evening and the guests began to drift into smaller, more intimate conversations scattered throughout the garden, the Duke drew Eleanor away from the main gathering toward a quiet path bordered by roses, not unlike the one where they had first spoken so honestly to one another months before. "Do you remember what I told you that day?" he asked, taking her hand as they walked slowly beneath the fragrant blossoms. "That anyone who overlooked you before had simply not been paying proper attention." "I remember every word," Eleanor said softly. "I find myself grateful every day since," he continued, "that fate saw fit to walk me through those particular doors on that particular evening. Whatever accident or fortune arranged it, I no longer believe it was mere chance. I believe some part of me was always searching for exactly the kind of honesty you offered so freely that night, even disguised as it was behind an embarrassed joke." Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, watching the last of the afternoon light filter gold through the rose garden, feeling a contentment so complete it seemed to settle into every part of her. "Perhaps it was chance," she said, "or perhaps we simply needed a small push to find each other, when both of us had grown too cautious to seek out honesty on our own. Whatever it was," the Duke said, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, "I intend to spend the rest of my life grateful for it." As the Duke of Ashcombe led his new wife back toward the celebration, past a crowd of well-wishers who had watched their unlikely story unfold from scandal to triumph, Eleanor understood at last that the quiet, overlooked girl she had once believed herself to be had never truly existed at all. She had simply been waiting, all along, for someone willing to look closely enough to see who she really was. 2 years had passed since Eleanor Whitmore became the Duchess of Ashcombe, and the quiet young woman who once hid at the edges of ballrooms had grown into a figure London now spoke of with genuine admiration rather than idle curiosity. She stood in the nursery of Ashcombe House on a bright autumn morning, watching her young daughter attempt her first unsteady steps across the polished floor, one small hand gripping the edge of a chair, while the other reached toward her father, who knelt patiently a short distance away, with open arms, and an expression of such complete devotion that Eleanor's heart still caught sometimes, even after 2 years of witnessing it daily. "Come now, little one," the Duke coaxed gently, and their daughter, encouraged by his warm voice, released the chair and toddled 3 wobbling steps directly into his waiting arms, squealing with delighted triumph at her own accomplishment. Eleanor laughed, crossing the room to join them, and for a moment the 3 of them simply existed together in that small, perfect pocket of happiness that had become so familiar over these past years. Their life together had settled into a comfortable rhythm far removed from the scandal and uncertainty that had once defined their beginning. The Duke had grown into his role with increasing confidence, no longer burdened by the constant pursuit of ambitious families now that his marriage stood as an unshakable fact rather than a rumor to be exploited. He had thrown himself into matters of genuine importance to him, championing agricultural reforms on his estates, and advocating in Parliament for causes he had once lacked the confidence to pursue while distracted by society's relentless matchmaking. Eleanor, for her part, had discovered within herself capabilities she never suspected during those early years of feeling overlooked and unremarkable. She had established a small charitable foundation supporting young women without family fortune or connection, offering education and modest financial support to those who might otherwise face the same quiet desperation she remembered so vividly from her own unmarried years. The foundation had grown steadily since its founding, and Eleanor took particular satisfaction in personally reviewing each young woman's circumstances, determined that no one under her care would ever feel as invisible as she once had. Margaret visited often, her own 2 children now old enough to play alongside their small cousin, and the sisters had grown closer with each passing year, their old rivalry replaced entirely by genuine friendship and mutual support. Eleanor's parents, too, visited regularly, her father taking particular delight in his granddaughter, spoiling her with an indulgence Eleanor found both amusing and touching given how carefully measured his affection had once seemed during her own difficult childhood years. On one such visit, Eleanor watched her father settle into the nursery armchair with her daughter perched happily on his knee, patiently naming every animal in a small picture book, while the little girl pointed excitedly at each illustration. It struck Eleanor, watching them together, how completely her own relationship with her father had transformed since those anxious early days, when he had worried so visibly over her unmarried future. He no longer looked at her with that quiet concern she remembered so well from her youth, but with a settled pride that had only deepened as the years passed. "You spoil her terribly," Eleanor said fondly, settling into the chair beside them. "I intend to spoil every grandchild you give me equally," her father replied without looking up from the picture book, and Eleanor laughed, though something warm settled in her chest at the easy affection in his voice, so different from the careful, worried tone she remembered from her own girlhood. The charitable foundation, meanwhile, had grown into something Eleanor took genuine pride in beyond even her own family's happiness. What had begun as a modest effort to support a handful of young women without fortune had expanded, over 3 years, into an organization providing education, practical training, and introductions to respectable employment for dozens of women each season. Eleanor made a point of meeting personally with every young woman who applied for support, remembering vividly how it had once felt to be dismissed and overlooked simply for lacking wealth or connection, and determined that her foundation would never treat any applicant with the careless disregard she herself had so often endured. She had recently taken on a young woman named Alice Merriweather, barely 18 and recently orphaned, whose quiet intelligence and careful determination reminded Eleanor sharply of herself at that same age, before a careless joke and a chance encounter had changed the entire course of her life. Watching Alice slowly gain confidence over their weekly meetings, watching her begin to speak more freely and carry herself with growing assurance, gave Eleanor a particular satisfaction that even her own considerable happiness at home could not quite match. Of Charlotte Vane, Eleanor heard very little in the years following her wedding, only occasional fragments of gossip carried through mutual acquaintances. Charlotte had remained largely absent from London society since her public disgrace at Lady Pemberton's assembly, eventually marrying a minor gentleman of modest fortune, in a quiet ceremony that drew little attention from the circles she had once so desperately courted. Eleanor felt no particular satisfaction in this outcome, only a distant, settled peace at having faced her rival honestly, rather than allowing fear to dictate her choices during those difficult weeks. It was on a crisp afternoon in early winter, nearly 3 years after that first fateful evening at Lady Marchmont's ball, that Eleanor encountered Charlotte again, quite unexpectedly. At a charity function neither had anticipated the other attending. Eleanor spotted her across the crowded hall, noticeably changed, dressed more simply than the elaborate gowns she once favored, her expression carrying none of the sharp calculation Eleanor remembered so clearly. For a long moment, neither woman moved, the years between them stretching awkwardly across the crowded room. Then Charlotte, to Eleanor's genuine surprise, approached first, her posture careful and uncertain in a way Eleanor had never witnessed from her before. "Your Grace," Charlotte said quietly, dropping into a proper curtsy. "I did not expect to see you here today." "Nor I you," Eleanor replied, studying the other woman carefully, searching for any remnant of the cold calculation that had once defined their every interaction, and finding, to her surprise, only weariness and something that might have been genuine humility. "I have thought often, these past years, about how I behaved toward you," Charlotte said, her voice barely above a whisper, glancing around as though fearful of being overheard. "I will not insult you by pretending I do not remember exactly what I did, or attempt to excuse it now with claims of youthful foolishness. I was cruel because I was afraid of becoming precisely the kind of woman I have since become anyway, overlooked and unremarkable, despite everything I once believed my careful strategies would prevent." Eleanor considered her words carefully before responding, remembering her own long journey from fear to confidence, remembering how close she herself had once come to believing that other people's judgment determined her entire worth. "I forgave you long ago, Charlotte," she said finally, and found as she spoke the words that they were entirely true. "Not because what you did was excusable, but because carrying that anger forward would have cost me more than it ever cost you. I hope you have found some measure of peace since then." Charlotte's eyes filled with unexpected tears, and she nodded once, quickly, before excusing herself back into the crowd, and Eleanor understood that whatever closure either of them might find from that brief exchange, it was enough, finally, to let the old rivalry rest entirely in the past where it belonged. That evening, Eleanor recounted the encounter to her husband as they sat together in the quiet study where so many of their most honest conversations had taken place over the years, their daughter finally asleep upstairs under the watchful care of her nurse. "Do you regret extending forgiveness so easily?" the Duke asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected her answer. "Not at all," Eleanor said, settling comfortably against his side as the fire crackled softly in the hearth. "I think I understood something today that I could not have understood 3 years ago, standing in that ballroom demanding the truth be heard. Charlotte's cruelty came from the same fear that once kept me hidden at the edges of every gathering, believing myself unworthy of being truly seen. We simply chose different paths in response to that fear. I chose eventually, to be honest. She chose, for a long time, to attack rather than risk being overlooked herself." The Duke pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, drawing her closer against him. "I have long believed," he said quietly, "that the woman who walked through those ballroom doors that night found herself facing a Duke who badly needed reminding what genuine honesty looked like. I simply did not expect that reminder to reshape the entire rest of my life so completely." Eleanor smiled against his shoulder, thinking of the careless joke that had somehow led her to this exact moment, this quiet study, this steady, patient love that had grown from such an unlikely beginning into something neither convenience nor scandal had ever managed to shake loose. Whatever fear had once kept her small and hidden had long since dissolved entirely, replaced by a settled confidence that no ballroom whisper, no jealous rival, no uncertain future could ever fully threaten again. Their daughter stirred briefly in her sleep upstairs, a small sound carried faintly down through the quiet house, and Eleanor felt the familiar pull to check on her, though she knew the nurse would see to any need before it became a true disturbance. Instead, she remained where she was, wrapped in her husband's arms beside the fire, allowing herself simply to rest in the steady comfort of an evening, with nothing urgent demanding her attention, no scandal to navigate, no rival to face, only the quiet certainty of a life she had built deliberately, rather than one that had simply happened to her. Outside, the first snow of winter began drifting quietly past the tall windows of Ashcombe House, and Eleanor closed her eyes, content in the knowledge that whatever chance or fortune had first brought her and Nathaniel together, the years since had been built on something far sturdier than either luck or convenience. They had been built, patiently and deliberately, on the simple, hard-won choice to keep choosing honesty, again and again, long after the ballroom doors that first changed everything had closed quietly behind them.